Hello and welcome to the Roker Report Lasses podcast in association with Sunderland Community Soup Kitchen and Her Game 2, the campaign against sexism and misogyny in football. You've just heard our theme music Science by the brilliant Sunderland band Big Fat Big, and I'm Charlotte Patterson, your host for today's podcast. Over the last few weeks, we've been keeping a close eye on Sunderland women and other clubs during this off-season with news of full-time football, change of sponsorships, transfers, all keeping us busy. But it would be remiss of us to forget and neglect the incredible tournament which just got underway over a month ago, the Women's 2022 Euros, taking place right here in the UK. So given the historic achievement by the Lionesses, we asked a special guest to join us on today's podcast. Most of us will likely be aware of this guest and the brilliant work they've done over the years in terms of following women's football and promoting it, with 2 successful books on the Lionesses and a 3rd book just being released over a month ago. But as well as writing football books, this guest has also covered 3 Women's World Cups for the Times and Eurosport. So we could think of nobody more perfect to talk to us about the Lionesses, her new book Unsuited for Females, life as a sports writer, and perhaps a little bit about her background. Big welcome to the podcast, Carrie Dunn. How are you this afternoon?
I am still floating on a cloud, and thank you so much for having me. And I'm going to be kind of just jabbering probably senselessly because I'm still absolutely thrilled about what we saw at Wembley last week.
Yeah, it's I'm exactly the same. All of this week when people have been talking about it, I'm still just in complete shock. Obviously the realisation is somewhat starting to kick in, but it's just absolutely amazing. I mean, what a tournament that we've had.
It's been incredible. It was a great tournament, I think, even if you were a neutral. But I think for an England fan, whether you're a long-serving England fan or someone who's come to it new this summer, I mean, what a thrilling final. What a way to win. What a way to win a tournament. What a way to win a trophy. Just, amazing. Amazing.
Yeah, it's absolutely brilliant. And again, thank you so much for taking time out after what I imagined has been a very busy period for yourself to come and talk to us. It's greatly appreciated. So, I suppose to start off, I mean, would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself? How did you take up an interest in sports, specifically football? Do you have a specific team that you follow, and how did you get into writing?
Oh, that's a really, really big question. I'm not gonna answer it fully. We'll be here for the next 3 hours. But but I guess I've always been a football fan. I grew up in Bedfordshire, and my nearest team was Luton, so I watched Luton as a kid, as a teenager. I was a home and away girl, and up to 2003, and I'd moved away. I'd moved to London for university by then. And I was involved in the Supporters Trust when we had a very strange takeover. I'm not going to go into that because that's just completely mad. But if any of you are interested, if you have a look on YouTube for Trouble at the Top and look for Trouble at the Top Luton, you can get a small insight into what it was like. And up until about 2006, and I don't know whether you remember this, but Mike Newell was the manager of Luton then. And he was not very happy with a decision made by, I believe it was Amy Fern, who was running the line one day. And I believe his exact words were, what's she doing here? This is professional football. And it was just a kind of, there should be no women in professional football. And I was, at that point, because I'd moved away as well and I was coming backwards and forwards, and it was costing me so much money because I was obviously a grown-up and not getting discounted prices by that point. I was kind of like, why am I wasting my time supporting this man's team when he doesn't think women should be here? And obviously I'd also started my career at that point. I was a very, very inexperienced football writer, and I was just... I guess I was exhausted by that point. I was just like, I don't want to watch this man's team. I don't want to support him. I can't bring myself to cheer him because I was involved in professional football, and I was thinking, if he doesn't think I should be there, then I won't be there. So I guess after that, it was kind of quite easy to detach and concentrate on football writing. But the funny thing is, I actually got my first paid freelance work was writing for the Luton Club website. It was great. I did features every other week, and I got to sit down with one of the players. This is the time, kind of before Zoom calls and that kind of stuff. I would go to the ground every week, sit down with a player, and talk to him for like an hour. It was great. I loved it. But women's football, this kind of stems back again to about the same time as I started watching men's football properly. And it's odd because I maintain there was like a little generational glitch from about like 1989 to about 1993. Channel 4 broadcast the Women's FA Cup every year. So as a small child, I remember watching women's football on television. So the likes of Marianne Spacey and Karen Walker and Hope Powell when she was a player. All these names that people would recognise now as kind of legends of women's football, but they might not have seen play. I actually did see play on television. And people who are just like a couple of years younger than me don't remember that at all. So this generation of Lionesses are always like, we grew up not watching women's football on television. And there's just this kind of really small period when it was on television. I remember watching it. So I always knew women played football, and obviously it was more difficult to follow it because it didn't have a great deal of newspaper coverage. But it wasn't kind of like a great leap for me to be following it too and to write about it and to know that there was a history there. And so I became a journalist when I left university. I started being a sports writer from 2005 onwards. 2005 was the Euros in England, and it didn't get a great deal of media coverage. 2007, another Women's World Cup. 2009, another Euros. And I remember just trying to persuade my editor at the time that you should really be covering this Euros. England have got to the final. Let's do something about it. And they did let me do like a live blog, like a minute by minute. And of course England lost, but I felt it was kind of like a little triumph that they'd caught enough attention that a very big national newspaper let me do a minute by minute report on it. This is kind of where we were like only 13 years ago. 2011, I was in Germany. I remember sleeping in a luggage rack to get from Dresden to Frankfurt on an overnight train for the group stages. And then 2015, I was out in Canada, and there were so few of us out there reporting. We literally had like a press conference in a cafe because there was just no point trying to book a room for a big press conference because there were so few of us there. So, fast forwarding to now, just 7 years on from that, when, UEFA are just packed out, they've got, they're oversubscribed for accreditation. It is incredible to see the progress in such a short space of time. And yeah, it's just amazing to see the way that the women's game has grown just in the time that I've been covering it. It does make me feel very old, obviously, but yeah, it's been immense progress.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, like you said, it's just amazing to see. I mean, you think that, women's football, it's been around a long time, but it was banned for a very long time as well, and since then, it's trying to make waves in developing itself. But it's only really, you could say, in the last couple of years that it's really made a huge push. We saw, wasn't it, it was around 2019, I think, when the WSL, obviously the top division of women's football, finally became fully professional, and that was only in 2019, and it just seems crazy in this day and age. But obviously, maybe we should get on to talking about your book, which I finished about a month ago. I finished it pretty quickly after it came out because I was like, I really want to read this before the Euros begins. And it was brilliantly written, allowing sort of the reader to travel through time, through, each chapter, covering football from specific time periods. Though, I thought I was aware of all the sort of pioneers and innovators in women's football, but your book actually, it interviews certain people and highlights that there's so much more history and like key figures that people maybe never have heard of, long before most of us realised, who had a huge fundamental role in progressing women's football. I was born in the 90s. I grew up with thinking the likes of, Faye White and Katie Chapman, Rachel Yankee, Kelly Smith. To me, they were the trailblazers of our time, but it actually started, almost 100 years ago with the likes of Nettie Honeyball and Lily Parr and Bella Ray. And I just think it's important that those people are, given their deserved credit and appreciation for what they did. So I suppose, what made you write your book, Unsuited for Females? What made you want to look at women's football in history?
Yeah, well, I'd written 2 books like in the 5-6 years before I started working on this book. So The Roar of the Lionesses, which came out in 2016, and then The Pride of the Lionesses, which was out in 2019. And I was always very conscious that when I was writing those books, because I wanted to make sure I was giving a full view of the pyramid, I also wanted to make sure I gave kind of some historical context in there, because I think there is a tendency, maybe, to kind of think everything is great in women's football now. It's a new thing. Look at us go. Whereas it's really important, I think, to acknowledge that it's not a new thing. Women have fought over a century to be able to play on this stage and get this kind of recognition. So it was kind of the book that a lot of people kept asking me to write in a way. People kept saying to me, would you like to write a history, like a full history of women's football in England? And I was like, I don't want to write a full history. That's not really my kind of thing. What I'm interested in is kind of digging more deeply into people's individual experiences. And so I came up with the idea for Unsuitable for Females, these kind of series of pen portraits telling the story of the past kind of century and a half of women's football through like a little snapshot in time, through individuals kind of piecing their stories together to give an overview of women's football history. And I guess the important thing to note is that these are just the stories that we've uncovered at the moment. There are going to be hundreds and thousands more women whose stories haven't been told yet, whose stories might not have even been recorded anywhere, because it's really difficult to tell women's history, whether that's sporting history or just general history, because obviously when records aren't documented or digitised, it's really tough to be able to find a woman in a census if she's got married and changed her name and the paperwork's gone missing somewhere. It's really hard to like piece things together, whereas with men, they leave more of a footprint quite often because they keep the same name from birth. A woman 100 years ago would definitely have changed her name on marriage, and then you're kind of thinking, oh, where's she gone? And then the additional problem with the footballers is so many of them kind of adopted stage names, like Nettie Honeyball. That wasn't her real name. We're not even quite sure who she is. We know a lot about the Nettie Honeyball character, but we don't know who she actually was, or whether this was a kind of a stage name or a character name that passed down across several different people. So it's really difficult to uncover those first years of women's football history. So the pen portraits that we have got only a very, very limited insight into what is doubtless a massively rich and exciting history, and we've only just started uncovering it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's so sad to think really of how many stories have been lost over time just because, like you said, the records just aren't there, or women having to play under pseudonyms or false names just so that they can play the game, just because they were so looked down upon by the rest of society. So hopefully, with time we'll start to uncover more stories, the more women's football, becomes more accepted in society. I mean, we've already seen just from the Women's Euros a huge sort of improvement. Whether that's long standing, we're not to know, but certainly there seems to be a lot more interest than there has been at previous tournaments. And the time is now. So hopefully those that maybe were around towards that part, or generations that they've passed it down, those stories will slowly begin to come to light. And hopefully now the way things are with women's football, we're starting to record everything that's happening, documenting it all down, so that in generations and years to come, everything that we're doing right now is there available for people to look at and to share those amazing stories. But something as well in your book which came across to me was actually how supportive a lot of men were to the women's cause in terms of accepting them into football and helping them develop foundations. I mean, that isn't to say that everybody was so supportive, whether that was men or, other women that, didn't want, were opposed to women playing football, and it was viewed as sort of a rough sport to play, I suppose. It's not ladylike, let's put it as that. But they had this fixed idea and narrative, and we do face a difficult battle. So with social media having a large part to play in what people sort of how they are online. Obviously, we see trolls, people having banter to goad a reaction. Yet in your book, you detail about, you know, fathers setting up football teams for the daughters, young boys allowing girls to join in with them, you know, playing football in the streets. The likes of Vic Akers, you know, practically setting up and starting Arsenal women, and Harry Batt creating England's team, which, you know, competed in front of 90,000 people in the Azteca Stadium, in what was an unofficial tournament, unfortunately. But, and, you know, even today, you know, we see the likes of Ian Wright being a huge, you know, advocate for women's football. So, I mean, would you say there's enough awareness and recognition of men's involvement in supporting the game, or, you know, should we, it sounds hard to say, but should we just focus on the women who continue to face, like, you know, fight in the face of adversity? It's a difficult one.
It is. I know exactly what you're saying. You feel a little bit uneasy, don't you? Kind of giving men credit for just being, you know, nice about things and not being dreadful. And that's kind of like awful for the women who were working so hard to support other women, but also really awful for men, because most of them are nice. It's fine. But yes, you're absolutely right that there have been absolutely crucial male allies for women's football from the foundations, yes. And we could go back to, you know, Alfred Frankland, who was the manager of the famous Dick Kerr ladies. Yeah, you mentioned Harry Batt. And then, of course, the first England managers of the official England team, they were men too. So we've always had male involvement in women's football, supporting these women who have fought for the right to be able to play. I mean, go back to the 1966 World Cup winners. Bobby Moore and Jeff Hurst and Martin Peters were three of the leading lights in the campaign to have a Women's World Cup. You know, it wasn't that uncommon, but it just wasn't picked up popularly. And I guess it'd be difficult to do that when the FA were just still kind of saying no, 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 no matter how high profile you are. And I think the likes of Ian Wright now, they have a slightly different role, because you mentioned the social media trolling and that kind of stuff. I think a lot of the men who are noisily against women's football now, or women's involvement in football, they won't listen to women. So what they need is they need men to call them out. And it's the same as with a lot of sexism that we see in society. They're not going to listen to women saying, no, you're wrong. But other men that they respect saying, no, you're wrong, they might listen to. That's why that call-out video he did on Alan Sugar was so good during the Euros, telling him it was foolishness. Yeah, I mean, that kind of stuff, that kind of unequivocal call-out has been absolutely fantastic. And using his platform and his position to advocate for the women's game. And I think it's great, and I think more men could afford to do that too.
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose as well with Ian Wright, it's, I mean, you want sort of genuine allies. You don't want people necessarily just wanting to go with the flow and, you know, be seen to be like, oh yeah, I'm a pro advocate of women's football, but then that was just for the Euros and then that trails off. But, you know, Ian Wright, you know, even before the Euros, he's been heavily involved in, say, I know he has his links with Arsenal, but, you know, he regularly attends games. He's like on close you know, personal level with all of the players. You can see how much it means to him, and that he does genuinely have a passion for the women's game. So it's so great to see, and, you know, just hopefully in time we get more, you know, Ian Wright's, you know, providing that representation for men, and exactly what you said. Hopefully more men will listen to it if it is coming from a man who generally enjoys women's football. But there were so many incredible details and stories in this book that I really enjoyed. I mean, there was so interesting to read. I mean, there was the one about Alex Ferguson, who stole sort of the only available helicopter in Monaco, which when it came across it, I was like, really? It's such a random thing to have come across.
Well, I love that story. So what happened was Sylvia Gore, who was the first woman to score an official goal for England, had been invited to the same UEFA ceremony as Alex Ferguson, and Sylvia passed away a couple of years ago. So I spoke to her cousin, who was her +1 at lots of these events. And Carol is not massively a football fan. She followed it because of Sylvia. So Sylvia is kind of pointing out all these famous people on their flights across. She's like, oh, look, there's Alex Ferguson. And then they get off, and Alex Ferguson's getting helicoptered to the venue. And poor Sylvia and Carol are like, oh, looks like we're taking the bus then.
Yeah, it's what I mean. It's brilliant stories like that, and then obviously that covers some really interesting stories, but also some quite sort of sad ones as well. Like the likes of Lincoln City, are essentially being rebranded as Notts County. The rise and fall of Doncaster Bells. I mean, it's quite a shock really, because I used to follow Doncaster Bells when I was a little bit younger, and they were the powerhouse of women's football. And to be honest, I kind of lost track of them, and I didn't realise just how like low that they'd fallen really. And then at the same time we've got the undeniable impact of Chippy, Julie Chip Chase, and the story of Lowestoft ladies. I had never heard about that, so it was really interesting to hear about it. And it's a shame as well where there's not too much information documented about them and the records and the accolades that they achieved. But I mean, were there parts of your research that surprised you when writing the book? Things that were new to you, or tidbits which you just knew you had to include?
I guess when I started planning the book, I had an idea of what I wanted to cover roughly, but of course I didn't know a lot of the detail of it all. So when I first planned it, I was intending to stop when the WSL started, and then I realised that I couldn't, because I think, as you mentioned, the rebranding of Lincoln as Notts County and then the way that Notts County folded, I just thought, I can't not write about that, because I think that's an absolutely vital part of recent women's football history that hasn't really been talked about, because it's no one really wants to talk about a failure, I guess, and B, I think the players have found it quite difficult to talk about. So I felt quite lucky that they trusted me with that story, because I think it was quite painful for them to go over it again. Obviously they've all come out of it and they've gone into different and better things, but to lose your job in that way, I think, was quite shocking. And you mentioned the Bells, and again, you have to write about the Bells when you're writing about women's football history. How can you not? But again, I had to work in Julie Chipchase and the reaction to her shocking death, because I think that came as quite a surprise to a lot of people, and it was quite near my book deadline. So again, it was challenging, I guess, to talk to people who knew and loved Chippy about her and her legacy when the loss of her was still so raw. So again, I'm so grateful that people were able to talk to me about it. And I guess the entire way through, I felt so fortunate that I was able to talk to these incredible people who fought for the right for women to be able to play football over the past 50, 60 years. So some of these women that I spoke to, they are senior citizens now. They are their 70s, 80s, and they're still here to tell their stories. It's absolutely incredible that they haven't been documented formally before that. I saw someone tweet last night, Chris Slegg, who wrote an excellent history of the Women's FA Cup with Pat Gregory. He said, this November will be the 50th anniversary of the first formal England international against Scotland. Why aren't we having a match to mark that? And I was like, we really should. We still have most of those players around. Let's mark that. Let's give them some public recognition. Let's have that event, because they're not going to be around forever. We don't want to lose more generations of women's football history because we were too lazy to mark it, or we didn't think about it at the time. We thought there'd always be another chance, because there isn't always another chance. You need to make sure that you take these opportunities. And just after England have won the Euros for the first time, to mark 50 years of the first official international, there could not be a better time to do that. Let's do it.
Yeah, no, I was just about to say, strike while the iron's hot with all the interest in, the current women's England team. There is no better time than to, educate people and teach them about all these, trailblazers again and pioneers and people who've had involvement in the women's game, exactly as you said, before sort of those stories are lost or before they become, almost forgotten in a certain sense. Bring them to the limelight, give them the sort of recognition that they should have had all of those years ago, and give them it now. Again, just that impetus of continuing, because I mean this is something that obviously the likes of Ian Wright and Alex Scott spoke about after the game, is we don't want this to just be, everybody is getting involved with women's football and it only lasts for a few months. We don't want a honeymoon period. We want this to be sustained and to be continuous. So we need to be looking at various different ways in which we can continue to engage interest. I mean, obviously it's been really good that we've arranged that friendly with the USA and it's already sold out, and that's going to be huge because obviously they're world champions. But again, little things like that. I mean, I didn't even know that, that it's 50 years. So, getting it out there and being like more public and the marketing side of things. And but yeah, obviously the current England players, were mentioning the impact that the previous, England players have had. They've led the way, they've paved the way. We've had Jill Scott, who performed in the 2009 Euros, who just missed out, and obviously it's huge for her to get that medal finally for all of these years. So it's so good to see that as much as they're enjoying the success, they are recognising those that helped them get to this point. What's your thoughts on the current England squad and this victory? I mean, what does it mean for the future of women's football?
Oh, it's huge. And I think you're right to acknowledge that they've been talking about the history. And I think that's been a deliberate stance of the camp. I'm fairly sure that it's something that Serena Wiedmann has deliberately done. I know that each member of the squad received a copy of Professor Jean Williams's book, called A History of Women's Football, before the tournament. So that kind of understanding where they fit in the grand scheme of women's football has been part of the camp when they approach the tournament. And I think it's really paid off, and I think it's been wonderful to see them acknowledge it. But yeah, I mean, seeing this win and then seeing them use that platform immediately to not only pay tribute to the pioneers, but to call for greater football facilities for the next generations, I think that's absolutely fantastic. I think it just shows their awareness of the struggles that women's football has gone through to get to this point. Because these women who have just won the Euros, they haven't had an easy time of it. I mean, Ellen White, for example, I'm sure you've seen that newspaper from 1999, her local newspaper front page, and it calls her Soccer Girl, which is hilarious to start with. But she wasn't allowed to play in a league dominated by boys. The league wouldn't let her play. Can you imagine? Ellen White wasn't allowed to play in the league, in her local league. And I believe what happened after that was that her dad set up a girls' team for her to play for. So this is our current England team have gone through stuff like that they weren't allowed to play, and they've travelled the country and they've gone to training week in, week out and all that kind of stuff, and they've got past all that, and they've brought back the first senior trophy that an England football team has won in nearly 60 years. That is incredible, and we're seeing an immense payoff. And you mentioned how recently the WSL went fully professional. We're seeing like really quick results of investment in players, in the infrastructure, in the coaching, in the domestic competition. If you invest in it, you'll get the return. And people have always kind of worried about women's football going, oh, well, it's not making a profit and all that kind of nonsense. You will see a return on your investment. Just back women's sport, back women. They'll get the job done.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I have this argument almost every day, if I'm honest, on social media, because it just frustrates me to no end, because it's like, well, you saying, oh, the standard of women's football is poor, that's not going to do anything. It's like, well, if you invest money into it, support into it, it is going to grow. That's exactly where, how the men's game is where it's at now, is because of all of that back, and the things that when they started up the Premier League, and obviously all the monies and the sponsorships that came with that the only reason that it's one of the best leagues in the world now is because of all those things. And I'm not saying that that's going to happen in a year's time for women's football, but if you give it time, if you give it the support, you give it the money that it needs, particularly starting from grassroots, making sure that girls get appropriate training and coaching and facilities, then we're going to see a better standard of football played. So something we've always been proud of in the North East and Sunderland is our ability to have produced fantastic talent over the years. Obviously in this tournament we've seen the likes of Lucy Bronze, Jill Scott, Beth Mead, who've come through our first team and have gone on to join some brilliant teams and represent England. However, understandably, women's football changes and things have happened quite dramatically, like we touched on before, that there's been a rapid sort of potentially improvement in the way that things are now. You know, in the prologue of your book, you know, you spoke to people that you'd interviewed and asked them their thoughts of modern day football and for the future. And I was quite interested actually by you know, some of the responses in that. You know, it's a topic of conversation we have quite regularly, in which you want women's football to be taken seriously, but at the same time, do we want to be, you know, have the same model as men's football? Because, you know, I find myself increasingly falling out of love with sort of mainly, you know, English football and the top leagues, because it's just so business and money orientated. I mean, you know, what's your thoughts currently, you know, on women's football in terms of sort of the domestic leagues? You know, are we seeing a positive change, you know, or are we becoming, you know, business and money orientated?
Yeah, it's a difficult one, isn't it? I mean, we saw, you know, in the days after the Euros win, we saw the reports that the Premier League were being approached to take over, and Emma Hayes was saying she thinks it's a great idea. And I can understand the big clubs thinking that, because, you know, having an organisation with commercial experience take over is probably going to be what they want to see. But I think it's important to also bear in mind the unique character, I guess, the personality of women's football, because it's not a direct reflection of the men's game. It has a very different atmosphere for starters, but also look at the setup. I mean, we've got a much smaller league, and I know this talks about expanding perhaps, which is another matter entirely, but look at the teams we've got in the Championship, you know, Lewes, Durham, Coventry United. If the Premier League come in and want to make it more like the men's game, what happens to those clubs? What happens to the kind of more community focused, the more, I guess, community attached clubs that aren't attached to a men's parallel club that's been bankrolling them with a different model of running? What happens to them? So I think there are special characteristics, special parts of the women's game that I would want to see preserved. I wouldn't want to see it necessarily reflect the men's game directly. So I think that needs to be borne in mind when we're talking about having a different organisation take over the running of the women's game.
Yeah, definitely. And like what you touched on before with the sort of the women's game is so different to the men's game. I mean, one thing that I love in particular is how inclusive it is. I mean, obviously, you know, there's no sort of trouble within the stands. You know, fans of both teams can just sit with each other. There has been conversations as to whether we should be trying to make it a bit more, I don't want to say tribal necessarily, but, you know, having designated away stands to create a bit more of an atmosphere as opposed to it being very sort of family orientated. But, you know, the inclusivity, I mean, we have, you know, great representations of the LGBTQ plus community, you know, it's just accepted in women's football. There's no problem with that. I mean, not to my knowledge, but I'm never aware of any incidences of, you know, of homophobia or racist incidences within the game. Because I think, you know, women in football, we know what it's like to be oppressed in a certain sense. So we're very inclusive of everybody being involved in the game. But, you know, something I've unfortunately come across a lot with, you know, playing football, following it, talking about it, is a lot of, you know, sexist abuse online. You know, most of it I can kind of just brush off my back, but some comments or messages I've received in the past have been pretty appalling and disgusting in nature, and you just think, why are you sending this? I mean, you don't have to talk about anything that would make you uncomfortable, but have you ever, you know, experienced sexism? And, you know, if you have, you know, how have you overcome it, dealt with it? I mean, is there any words of advice for women trying to make it in the industry?
If I think back to when I first started going to football, I think when you're a little girl going to matches with your dad, you're kind of like, you just acknowledge it as a kid then. If you're a teenage girl going to football by yourself, you're suddenly fair game. So yes, I remember the kind of heckles that I would get as a teenage girl, you know, I ignored it at the time. Now, kind of looking back on it, you know, 25 years later, it's kind of like, that's just absolutely hideous. That poor 15-year-old girl who listened to that kind of nonsense. I feel bad for 15-year-old me, really, and wish that I could have done something about it at the time, but I guess you don't think about it. And I think quite often in football, and this isn't just with sexism, you try to ignore the bad stuff because you love football so much. You try to make excuses for it almost. And I think we kind of try and persuade ourselves, we love football, we'll carry on, we'll push on. But then you also kind of have to think about the women who decided, I can't be bothered with this. I don't want to put up with this week in, week out. Think of all the talent we've lost to the game, not just as players, but as, TV broadcasters, as writers, as coaches, as referees, who would have been put off football for whatever reason. And I think, you said there's no homophobia and racism in the women's game. I think there probably have been elements. I think it's probably a little bit too idealised to say that there isn't. I can think of one very famous incident only a few years ago involving some quite big names in the women's game. So it's not perfect, but I do think it is better than the men's game. And I think a lot of that is because it isn't quite so tribal. And I understand why the authorities and clubs do want to kind of appeal to, let's say, men's team supporters, because it's a quick way to get people through the gate saying, look, this is part of your club, come and cheer them on. And that's going to get people through the turnstiles. But again, I think that kind of slightly friendlier, more welcoming atmosphere has been a real asset to the women's game. But having said that, if there's more demand for tickets and we're in bigger grounds, perhaps it's going to be more difficult to preserve that anyway. So perhaps this is a new era for women's football, and I'm just being a little bit nostalgic for what we've had in the past, and we can't have both that welcoming atmosphere and money and investment and progress in the women's game. Perhaps we can't have both. So perhaps we're at a real turning point of the women's game now.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's so hard to kind of decide how you want it to go, because like I touched on before, we want it to do so well, but it's, what potential sacrifices need to be made to progress it to that next level. And you never know whether that's going to be a good thing or a bad thing. I follow the women's championship quite a lot with supporting Sunderland, and obviously I've got Durham, who are a local team to me as well. And we saw, last year what happened with Coventry United, and you kind of, you want to appeal and make women's football better is, what can you lose? And where we might have more situations similar to what happened to Coventry, that's the concern. So I think it's about doing things in a sort of steady manner, not rushing to anything. Things need to be thought through properly before, we make an ultimatum or a final decision, working things out logistically, looking at the finances, looking at the marketing side of things, speaking to the fans as well, because it's like, what do they want at the end of the day? Because like I touched on before, like I've lost a lot of interest in sort of men's football, particularly in the top divisions, because I just think they've lost all of that sort of community outreach that they had. Kind of like what you touched on right at the start, how you were able to just interview players with no problems whatsoever, because it was just so easy back then, whereas now it's so many people that you've got to get in contact with, and you can ask them a question and they can't answer it, and so it's whether we want the women's game to head that way. But I suppose, obviously, we've been talking for quite some time, but before we wrap up, I just wanted to, again, thank you for taking the time to come out on our podcast to talk today. And it was just to give you really a chance to, promote, advertise, or talk about any work projects that you come up. Obviously, I definitely advocate for everybody to read Carrie's book, Unsuitable. It was absolutely fantastic. Thoroughly enjoyed it. But, obviously you've got your 3 books out on the Lionesses, which will be likely available on all, retailers and websites. But you've also dabbled in writing on wrestling and academia too, haven't you? So is there anything you'd like to promote or talk about?
Yeah, I guess I just wanted to thank you for having me on. I mean, I guess it's important to say that women's football, even though we've had this massive success this summer, it's still commercially seen as very niche. So if anyone follows me on Twitter, you'll have seen I've been tweeting about the book and sharing links, etc., etc. Just because it's so difficult to prove that it's actually something that appeals to readers. So please do, if you've read the book, please do leave a review on whatever website you bought it from. If you haven't read it, then please try and get a hold of it. I'm very happy to sign any copies. Just get in touch with me on Twitter, and I'm always happy to talk on Twitter too. So just drop me a line. And you're right, I have written about wrestling before. I would love to write some more about wrestling, but I currently do have another project related to women's football on the go. So fingers crossed that the Lionesses winning will push that over the line, and I'll have an exciting announcement to make soon.
Oh, fantastic. So we'll have to keep our eyes and ears peeled. So just a reminder that obviously club football returns very soon in late August, and that we'll be writing lots of articles over at Roker Report, and we've got quite a few pieces already in the works that'll be coming out soon. Please like, subscribe, share and leave a 5-star review on your podcast platform of choice, and you can find us on all of your usual socials under R&R Lasses or through our link tree. Once again, a big thank you to Carrie Dunn for joining us on this episode. Thank you to everyone who listened, and thank you to Big Fat Big, whose music will see us out. Cheers and see you in the next one. Chemistry, biology, toxic misogyny, still haven't had a single apology. Chemistry, biology, toxic misogyny, still haven't